The driveway wasn't supposed to look like that, not like a circus, not like a county fair, not like a full-blown suburban invasion with barbecue smoke curling into his pine trees and kids chasing each other across his gravel, but that's exactly what he saw the moment his truck rounded the bend. A dozen cars crammed bumper to bumper, 12 families unpacking coolers, tents, and inflatable mattresses as if they'd just arrived at summer camp instead of trespassing on private mountain land. He didn't even turn off the engine at first. He just stared, jaw tight, coffee forgotten in the cup holder, trying to make sense of the chaos. His cabin, his peaceful weekend retreat built by hand, was now the site of a mass vacation. And there she was at the center of it all, Karen, standing like a queen among chaos, clutching her clipboard, barking orders in a bright floral jacket as if she were directing some HOA-sponsored retreat. She didn't even flinch when she saw his truck. In fact, she waved. That wave hit him harder than any insult ever could. It wasn't fear or guilt. It was ownership, confidence, entitlement wrapped up in a gesture so casual it made his skin crawl. For 10 seconds he didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched the absurdity unfold. One man was unloading a canoe from the roof of his SUV. Another had set up a portable grill on the porch. A woman in flip-flops was handing out color-coded wristbands to kids. Wristbands. He blinked twice, then started to laugh, that dry, quiet laugh that comes when disbelief burns itself into something colder. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching the gravel. Karen spotted him and called out cheerfully, "Oh, you're early. Don't worry, we'll be careful with the furniture." He stood there, letting her words hang in the mountain air, his silence doing all the work. "Careful with the furniture," she'd said, like she was the owner, like he was some handyman who'd shown up ahead of schedule. The kind of arrogance you can't buy, only earn through years of HOA meetings and self-importance. "What exactly is going on here, Karen?" he asked, voice low but even. She smiled that strained, fake grin that said she was about to start a performance. "Oh, this is our community family weekend. We rented the cabin through me. It's all legal, don't worry." He felt something in his jaw tighten. "You rented it," he repeated slowly. "Yes, through the HOA short-term program," she said proudly, holding up her clipboard like a badge. "Everyone chipped in, and I handled the bookings. You'll love it. We have activities planned, a potluck, even a movie night." Her words buzzed around him like gnats. "Karen," he said, "this isn't an HOA property. It's my cabin." She blinked once, then laughed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on, we both know it's part of the mountain development. You're just outside the registry because you never filled out the paperwork. It's fine, I'll fix that later." She turned back to her clipboard as if that settled it. He stood there for a long moment, eyes sweeping the scene, the porch covered in camping chairs, the yard littered with toys, the smell of lighter fluid and sunscreen. One of the men, oblivious to the tension, shouted from the porch, "Hey, is the hot tub working?" That almost did it. He didn't yell, didn't argue. He just took a slow breath, walked to his truck, and leaned against it with a calm that was more dangerous than fury. Karen kept talking, her words a blur of self-assurance and nonsense about community spirit and sharing amenities. He looked past her, up at the sky, at the clouds sliding over the ridge, and in that silence, something inside him shifted. He realized he wasn't angry in the usual way. He was beyond it. He'd dealt with HOA letters, fines, inspections, even threats before, but this was personal theater. It was invasion disguised as organization. And she thought she'd won. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft enough that the laughter around them faltered. "If it's your cabin, then enjoy it." Karen smiled uncertainly, sensing the sarcasm but not the warning. "Thank you," she said with forced politeness, and turned to the families. "See? He's fine with it." Laughter rippled through the group again, the kind that people use when they think they're safe. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off without another word. She watched him go, probably thinking she'd shamed him into compliance, but she didn't know the mountain like he did. She didn't know about the old forestry road that looped behind the property, or the fact that every gate, every switch, every water valve still answered to his hand alone. He drove slow, taking the back trail that wound up through the trees until he reached the ridge overlooking his land. From there, the cabin looked small, surrounded by vehicles and smoke, the laughter drifting faintly up the slope like noise from another world. He parked, got out, and just stood there in the quiet, the scent of pine thick in the air, his reflection caught faintly in the truck's window. He remembered his father's words from years ago, "Never argue with fools in daylight, they're better performers than you'll ever be." He smiled at that. No, he wouldn't argue. He'd wait. He'd let them settle in, get comfortable, and when the sun went down, when the laughter turned into drunken noise and Karen finally relaxed enough to think she'd won for good, he'd start reclaiming what was his. He walked down the old path, through the woods until the back of the cabin came into view. The air smelled of charcoal and arrogance. He crouched by the basement window, peered inside, and saw his living room, a chaos of bags, coolers, and strangers' shoes. His father's old photograph still hung on the wall behind them, crooked but untouched. That was the moment his patience turned into resolve. He slipped around to the utility box, the same one he'd installed 10 years ago when the county grid was unreliable, and flipped the main breaker. The porch lights went dark. He could hear confused voices, laughter turning into concern. "Did the power go out?" someone shouted. "It's probably a fuse," Karen yelled back, still trying to sound in control. He stepped back, let the silence spread. Then he turned the water valve. Within seconds, shouts of surprise echoed from inside. "There's no water," someone cried. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, just locked the basement door from the outside, turned, and disappeared back into the trees. By the time he reached his truck again, the noise from below had changed, less laughter now, more arguing. He could see flashlight beams flickering around the porch, hear the panic beginning to bloom. He sat on the hood of his truck, poured himself a cup of coffee from his thermos, and listened to the mountain reclaim its voice, the wind through the trees, the slow creak of branches, the distant murmur of confused trespassers learning that the land doesn't answer to arrogance. His phone buzzed once. A message from Sheriff Daniels read, "Heard Karen's having another meltdown. You involved?" He smiled at the screen and typed back, "Just watching the show." As the first drops of rain began to fall, the laughter below finally died, replaced by the sound of frantic voices and car doors slamming. He leaned back, letting the cold rain hit his face, and thought, this was only the beginning. Tonight wasn't payback. It was education. He drove past the cabin slowly, pretending to check his phone while watching the 12 families scatter like ants across his gravel driveway, each claiming a patch of space as if they owned it. Folding chairs popped open, portable grills hissed, kids ran barefoot with plastic plates, and one man even dragged a karaoke speaker out of his SUV trunk. Karen stood at the center, clipboard clutched to her chest, directing everyone like a camp counselor. He didn't honk, didn't yell, didn't even roll down his window. Just a calm nod, the kind that said I've seen enough. He drove down the hill and disappeared behind the bend, letting her think she'd won. But what she didn't know was that there was a second road, a narrow, old logging trail that looped back up the mountain and ended behind his woodshed. He parked there, shut the engine off, and sat for a moment, staring at the tree line glowing orange under the evening sun. His jaw tightened. She'd done it again. Renting out his cabin? That wasn't bold, it was madness. He grabbed the old keys, flashlight, and a small toolbox from the back seat and made his way through the trees, boots crunching dry needles, heart pacing with quiet fury. By the time he reached the cabin, he could hear laughter echoing across the yard, smell smoke from cheap charcoal, and hear the squeal of a generator powering a blender someone thought was necessary for making frozen margaritas in the mountains. He crouched low by the old pine and scanned the perimeter. The front porch light was on, a bulb she must have replaced. He chuckled at the thought. She was running a resort on property she didn't own. He eased around to the back deck, crouched by the basement door, and turned the latch quietly. It still worked. Inside, everything looked untouched. His tools, fishing rods, and that old family photo still on the wall. She hadn't dared to move anything yet. He smiled grimly, pulled out the padlock, and clicked it shut from the inside. Then he went room to room, locking windows, sliding bolts, and shutting off the main water valve. The sound of the last turn echoed through the pipes like a final heartbeat. Then he flipped the breaker switch. Outside, laughter continued for a few minutes before the porch light flickered off. The generator's hum suddenly felt smaller, the night darker. He peeked through the blinds as flashlights danced around the front step. One woman knocked on the door, then another. Karen's voice rose above them all, her confidence thinning by the second. "It's fine, it's just a tripped breaker. Don't panic." But panic bloomed anyway. Someone asked if there was running water. A kid shouted that the toilet wouldn't flush. Another man complained about the Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi, he thought, shaking his head. He watched the absurdity of it all. People treating his quiet cabin like a resort. He almost pitied them, but then remembered the way Karen had looked at him that morning, smiling like she owned the place. He stepped out onto the porch quietly, moved to the big iron gate at the end of the drive, and closed it behind him with a metallic clank that echoed through the trees. The padlock clicked into place, final and solid. He walked back to his truck and sat inside, taking out his old phone. He scrolled through the contact list until he found Sheriff Daniels. "Evening," the sheriff's voice came after the first ring. "I take it your weekend's gotten interesting?" He explained the situation briefly. Daniels laughed so hard he had to pause. "You're telling me she rented it out? 12 families? Good Lord. You want me to head up there?" He thought for a moment, eyes still on the glowing cabin lights in the distance. "Nah," he said. "Let 'em have their vacation. Just wanted you to know in case she calls screaming trespass." Daniels chuckled. "Fair enough. Want me to keep a cruiser nearby?" "Only if someone starts a campfire where they shouldn't," he replied. He hung up, leaning back against the seat, the tension finally giving way to a quiet grin. He opened his glove compartment, pulled out a thermos, and poured a small shot of coffee into the lid. The bitter taste hit perfectly. He turned on the radio low enough to blend with the night wind and just listened. Somewhere out there, 12 families were realizing they had paid a self-proclaimed HOA manager to rent them a powerless cabin with no water, no access, and no right to be there. He wondered how long it would take before the first one left. By midnight, the laughter was gone. A few car engines started, then stopped again. Someone yelled that the gate was locked. Karen's voice cut through the dark, shrill and furious, insisting that she had full authorization. He leaned his head back, eyes half closed, picturing her marching up to the locked gate in her bright pink jacket, shaking the chain, calling every number she had. He almost admired her stubbornness. It took nerve to fake authority this consistently. He watched as flashlights gathered around her SUV, their beams cutting through the mist. A few campers packed up early, tires crunching down the gravel as they retreated. When dawn came, the valley filled with a faint fog that clung to the ground like smoke. Birds stirred, light filtered through the pines, and the world seemed at peace again, except for the faint echo of voices arguing about refunds. He climbed out of his truck, stretched, and walked to the fence line. Through the haze, he could see Karen pacing with her phone held high, probably demanding someone, from the county, come open the gate. He turned back toward his porch, feeling no rush. Everything was calm, deliberate, and under control. He took a slow lap around the property, checking locks and testing the back doors one last time. Everything sealed tight. Even the generator switch was off. He found himself chuckling quietly at the absurdity of it all, an entire impromptu village in his driveway because one woman couldn't admit she'd gone too far. But under the humor was a deeper satisfaction. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance being restored. He paused at the front steps, looked at the cabin's hand-carved sign his father had made decades ago, and felt a quiet resolve harden inside him. This place had weathered storms, fires, lawsuits, and winters worse than this circus. It wasn't going anywhere. He took out his phone again, snapped a few photos from behind the fence. The packed SUVs, the lawn chairs still scattered, Karen's wild gestures as she argued with a man holding a cooler. Evidence, he thought. Not for revenge, but for record. You never know when proof comes in handy. He uploaded them quietly to his cloud storage, labeled the folder Unauthorized Rentals. Then, satisfied, he leaned against his truck and took one last look. The sheriff's truck passed by slowly on the lower road, Daniels giving a lazy salute through the window. He returned the gesture, smiling. The plan was working perfectly. By afternoon, most of the families had left, muttering complaints. Karen was left standing alone with her clipboard, shouting into her phone, pacing between the gate and the gravel road. He started his engine, rolled down the window, and let the gravel crunch beneath the tires as he pulled up beside her. She froze mid-sentence, color draining from her face. He didn't say much, just one sentence that hung in the cool air. Next time you rent something, make sure you actually own it. Then he shifted gears and drove off slow, leaving her standing in the dust, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. Karen woke up that morning convinced she was the victim. The sun hadn't fully risen when she started barking orders again, waving her phone around like a badge of authority while the few remaining families rubbed sleep from their eyes and brewed instant coffee on small propane stove. Her hair was frizzed, her clipboard damp with dew, but her determination hadn't cracked yet. He watched from the ridge above, binoculars resting on the hood of his truck, a faint grin tugging at his lips. It was remarkable how fast people could turn on one another once the illusion of order broke. Two families were already arguing over whose car blocked the exit, another was demanding a refund, and one elderly couple had simply packed their SUV and driven away without a word. Karen clung to her clipboard like it was life support, insisting she had everything under control, and that the owner would soon be facing legal consequences. He sipped his coffee slowly, amused by her commitment to the performance. The driveway below looked like a yard sale gone wrong, with half-folded tents, trash bags, plastic cups, and folding chairs scattered across the gravel. Children whined, dogs barked, and in the middle of it all Karen shouted into her phone, claiming she was coordinating with county enforcement. He knew exactly who she was calling, probably every contact in her HOA directory, demanding someone authorize a forced entry. He had expected this. He even anticipated her second move. When the first car from the HOA board rolled up, he could almost hear her triumphant tone from across the ridge. 3 men stepped out, each one dressed like they were attending a meeting rather than walking into a disaster scene. They shook hands with Karen, muttered something about procedure, and examined the locked gate with exaggerated seriousness. He watched them pace around the padlock like archaeologists studying an artifact. The sight made him laugh out loud quietly. He imagined their internal conversation, how none of them really wanted to admit they didn't know what they were doing. Karen's voice rose again. "It's our right of access. He can't legally block this road," she shouted. The men nodded hesitantly, clearly unsure. He decided to have a little fun. He pulled out his phone, opened the remote switch for his backup generator's sound system, a leftover prank from years back, and pressed the button. From the cabin porch, the faint hum of machinery came alive, echoing through the valley. Karen froze. "You hear that?" she whispered dramatically, like she'd stumbled into a spy movie. "He's inside," one man said nervously. She pointed toward the windows. "He's spying on us." The families murmured, shifting uneasily. He could almost taste the paranoia seeping through the air. He pressed another switch. A distant metallic thump came from the basement door, caused by an old pressure valve he rigged. A woman screamed, a child cried, and suddenly half the crowd stepped back. Karen tried to steady them, shouting, "He's bluffing! He's scared!" But her voice cracked in the middle, betraying the tremor in her chest. The sheriff's truck appeared again around noon, gravel dust trailing behind. Daniels stepped out, thumbs hooked in his belt, squinting in the sunlight. Karen practically ran to him, relief painted across her face. "Finally! Arrest him! He's threatening people. He's locked government property. He's endangering families." Daniels took off his hat, wiped his forehead, and looked at her with a mix of pity and amusement. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't government property. It's his. Always has been." She froze mid-rant. The HOA board members looked at each other uncomfortably. Daniels gestured at the gate. "See that line of trees there? Everything uphill from that fence belongs to him. You're standing on private land. You're lucky he's being polite." Karen's face flushed red. "That's impossible. The HOA map includes this entire ridge." Daniels shrugged. "Maybe your map needs updating. County records say otherwise." The words hit like a hammer. She stammered, waving papers in the air that flapped uselessly in the wind. Daniels took them, glanced over the first page, and let out a soft laugh. These were filed in 2008 under a proposed expansion that never passed. "This is just a draft, not an official deed." She reached for them, but he pulled them back. "You want to argue it, ma'am? Take it to the county office. But until then, you're trespassing." The silence that followed was thick. The families stood awkwardly beside their cars, realizing the weekend getaway had turned into a legal mess. He decided to make his presence known. He stepped out from behind the ridge, walked calmly toward the group, hands in his jacket pockets. Conversations died instantly. Karen stiffened like she'd seen a ghost. "Morning," he said casually. "Enjoying your stay?" No one spoke. Daniels nodded at him. "Morning, friend." He nodded back. "Just checking the locks. Everything's secure." Karen finally found her voice. "You can't, this is harassment." He tilted his head, pretending to think. "Funny, I thought renting someone else's house without permission was harassment. Guess we both learned something." The crowd chuckled nervously. Even one of the HOA men cracked a smile before catching himself. Karen's eyes darted around, realizing the tide had turned. "You'll regret this," she hissed, stepping forward. He raised an eyebrow. "Already regretted it the first time you tried to claim my mailbox. Didn't learn then either." Daniels cleared his throat to suppress a laugh. "Ma'am," he said, "it might be best you folks leave before we have to file an official report." Karen spun on her heel, shouting orders to pack up. But the families weren't exactly loyal soldiers anymore. They loaded their cars in silence, glancing at her like she was radioactive. When the last SUV rolled out, the driveway looked like a battlefield after retreat. Trash bags left behind, a broken chair, the faint smell of burned marshmallows. Daniels gave a low whistle. She really outdid herself this time. He nodded. "She'll be back though. People like her don't quit, they escalate." Daniels grinned. "Then I'll keep the paperwork ready." They shook hands and the sheriff drove off, leaving dust swirling in the sunlight. He stood there for a while, letting the silence settle, watching the wind push empty soda cans across the gravel. Then he went inside the cabin, unlocked it, and inhaled the familiar scent of cedar and smoke. Everything was untouched, exactly as he'd left it. He sat down on the porch, resting his boots on the step, and thought about how predictable people could be when pride took over common sense. That evening, while cleaning up the mess outside, he spotted something glinting near the fence, a key ring with a plastic tag labeled Karen HOA. He turned it over in his hand, laughing softly. The irony was perfect. He hung it on a nail by the door like a trophy. When the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the valley in gold, he sat with a cup of coffee and listened to the quiet return. Crickets replaced chaos. For the first time in 2 days the air felt still. But he knew it wasn't over. Karen's kind never let things die peacefully. He could almost hear her already plotting her next move, probably rallying the board, drafting complaints, maybe even looking up lawyers who owed her favors. He smiled, leaned back in the chair, and whispered to himself, "Let her try. The road's mine, the gate's mine, and the next act's going to be even better." The mountain swallowed the sound, and somewhere far below, a car door slammed, an echo hinting that the storm wasn't gone, just gathering strength for round two. "You said." The next morning broke with a heavy sky, clouds pressing low against the mountain ridge, the kind of weather that felt like a warning. He sat on the porch sipping black coffee, watching the mist curl through the pines, and knew before the first sound of engines that Karen wasn't done. Sure enough, a convoy of vehicles crawled up the dirt road like ants, 2 shiny SUVs, 1 pickup with a trailer, and behind them a flatbed truck carrying what looked suspiciously like a generator and bolt cutters. He set his cup down and sighed. This wasn't just another tantrum. This was an organized effort. The HOA had arrived in full force. He could hear Karen before he saw her, that shrill, commanding tone cutting through the trees as she waved her clipboard like a sword. She was flanked by a small army of board members, each one dressed like they were about to negotiate a merger, not trespass on private land. One of them wore a reflective vest, another carried a radio, and a third man held a binder labeled Emergency Enforcement Procedure. It was almost funny, almost. He leaned back in his chair, waiting, because part of him wanted to see how far they would go before realizing the trap they were walking into. The convoy parked just short of the locked gate. Karen stepped forward, adjusting her jacket, putting on her best official face. "Under HOA Bylaw Section 9, she began loudly, "we have the right to remove any obstruction to community access." Her words carried down the gravel drive like a rehearsed speech. He didn't move, didn't answer. One of the men from the board, a lanky guy with too much cologne, held up the bolt cutters and asked if he should start. Karen gave a dramatic nod. The metallic clang of steel on chain echoed like a gunshot through the valley. He waited until the second clang before stepping out from the porch and walking slowly toward them, calm and steady, like a man strolling through his own garden. They froze when they saw him. The bolt cutters stopped mid-swing. "Morning," he said simply. Karen blinked, then lifted her chin. "We're conducting official HOA maintenance." He smiled faintly. "Maintenance? On private land?" One of the board members shifted uneasily. Karen turned to him, snapping, "Don't back down. We have jurisdiction." He took another step forward, voice low and measured. "You don't. This road, that gate, this cabin, all of it, sits outside your HOA boundaries. You can check the county plats if you need proof." Karen smirked. "We already did." That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a sheriff's siren in the distance. Sheriff Daniels' truck appeared moments later, tires crunching slow over the gravel. He pulled up beside the group, killed the engine, and stepped out, hat in hand. "Morning, folks," he said with a tone that carried more warning than warmth. "Something wrong here?" Karen jumped at the opportunity. "Yes, officer, we're dealing with a trespasser and obstruction of community property." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Community property, huh?" He walked to the gate, tapped the post, and then looked at her. "This post is registered to Parcel 16, private lot, not HOA. You're about 50 feet past your jurisdiction line." Karen's voice faltered. "That can't be right. The HOA maps," Daniels cut her off, "are not legal deeds, ma'am. The county clerk updated those maps last spring. I suggest you double-check before you cut another man's lock." The board members looked uneasy now, mumbling among themselves. The man with the bolt cutters lowered them quietly. Karen, red-faced but still defiant, snapped, "We're simply ensuring safety. He's been threatening people." Daniels turned to the owner, smirking slightly. "You been threatening people?" "Only with property taxes," he said dryly. A few of the board members laughed under their breath. Karen shot them a deadly look. Daniels folded his arms. "Ma'am, unless you have a court order granting you access, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're trespassing. Karen's voice trembled between rage and disbelief. You can't possibly side with him. He's making a mockery of the HOA. Daniels adjusted his hat. Ma'am, I'm not siding with anyone. I'm enforcing property law. And right now, the only mockery I see is a group of people trying to break into a man's land. The silence that followed was sharp. The wind carried the faint creak of the gate chain swinging. Finally, one of the board members spoke quietly. Maybe we should go, Karen. She turned on him, shouting, Don't you dare walk away. He's bluffing. But the man had already started back toward his car. Another followed, then another. Within a minute, half of them were gone, leaving Karen standing with her clipboard trembling in her hand. Daniels gave her a sympathetic nod. Ma'am, I'd recommend you pack it up. You've already crossed a line. Don't make me write it up. She glared at him, eyes wet with fury, then turned to the remaining truck driver and hissed, Fine. Let's go. The engine rumbled, gears grinding as they backed down the road. He watched them go until the last tire disappeared around the bend. When the dust finally settled, Daniels exhaled deeply. You sure do attract excitement, he said, half amused. Guess it's my curse, he replied. They both laughed quietly. Daniels walked over and clapped him on the shoulder. I'll file a note in the county records. Make it clear this property's off-limits to HOA enforcement. That'll shut her down for a while. He nodded. Appreciate it. Daniels smiled. Just doing my job. But I gotta admit, watching her try to command an army with a clipboard? Worth the drive. They shared a laugh before Daniels headed back to his truck. As the sheriff's taillights disappeared, the mountain fell quiet again. He stood by the locked gate, running his fingers over the cold steel, the faint scent of dust and pine lingering in the air. What struck him most wasn't anger. It was a strange kind of calm, the realization that he didn't need to fight loudly to win. Sometimes silence did the work for you. He spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the yard, gathering the trash left behind by Karen's so-called rental event. Bits of ribbon, broken tent poles, empty soda cans, and a half-burned marshmallow bag littered the ground. As he worked, clouds thinned and the late sun broke through, streaking the valley with gold. He paused to take it in, the way the light touched the roof of his cabin and turned the metal gate into a glowing line of silver. Peace, he thought. Real peace. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Karen's pride wouldn't let her walk away quietly. She'd be back with new tricks, complaints, letters, maybe even a lawyer. He smiled at the thought. He already had a plan forming, something cleaner and quieter than shouting matches or legal threat. Something that would make sure no one ever tried to lay claim to his mountain again. As dusk settled, he sat on the porch with his journal open, sketching a rough map of the valley. Every line, every fence post, every water route. He marked property lines, access roads, and easements, proof that every inch of this land was his. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. He'd seen people like Karen before. They didn't lose gracefully, they regrouped. The sound of crickets rose from the fields, and the first star flickered above the ridge. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and whispered to the empty valley, "Round two's coming. Let's make it fun." The wind stirred through the trees in reply, rustling leaves like laughter. Down in the valley, faint headlights appeared for a moment, then faded, leaving the mountain once again wrapped in silence. You said. The following morning was bright, the kind of crisp mountain air that made everything feel too clean for the nonsense of HOA politics, and he woke up early with that calm before the next storm kind of feeling in his chest. He brewed coffee, watched mist lift off the treetops, and thought about the next move. Because people like Karen didn't retreat, they regrouped. Sure enough, his phone buzzed before he even finished his second cup. An alert from the county website showing a new complaint filed against his parcel, signed by none other than Karen herself. The accusation was ridiculous. Obstruction of community access, harassment, and unlawful gate installation. He couldn't help but laugh out loud. She'd gone from trespasser to victim overnight. But instead of anger, he felt something sharper, more strategic. He turned on his laptop, opened the folder of photos he'd taken of her rental operation, and selected a few choice shots. The 12 families setting up tents, her clipboard in hand, her directing them toward the cabin like a tour guide. He attached those to a neatly written email addressed to both the HOA board and the county property office. The subject line read simply, "Unauthorized short-term rental operation and property misrepresentation by HOA member." He typed slowly, methodically, every word clear and calm, making sure the tone wasn't angry but professional, the kind of letter that screamed credibility. When he hit send, he leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of balance shifting back in his favor. By mid-afternoon, word had already spread. He saw it in the way the HOA board's group chat leaked screenshots into his inbox, the way whispers carried through the local general store when he stopped by for diesel and nails. People loved gossip, and Karen's latest escapade was the juiciest story of the week. He could almost picture the emergency meeting forming at the HOA clubhouse, her trying to maintain control while the rest demanded answers. The idea made him chuckle, but he wasn't done yet. He wanted this lesson to stick. Back at the cabin, he began drafting another set of documents, this time official invoices addressed to Karen and the HOA jointly, line items for unauthorized use, property cleanup, and damages. He printed each one on crisp letterhead, signed them neatly, and sealed them in envelopes stamped with the words, "Payment due on receipt." It wasn't about the money. It was about making her feel the weight of paper, the same way she'd buried others in useless notices and fines. Late in the day, a knock echoed across the porch. He opened the door to find a courier standing there, holding a manila envelope. "Delivery from the HOA office," the man said. He signed the clipboard and took it inside. The envelope was thick, sealed with a self-important wax stamp like they were some medieval court. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter demanding he remove his gate, open public access, and apologize in writing for disrupting community harmony. He read the first paragraph, then folded the papers neatly, tucked them into a drawer, and poured himself another cup of coffee. He'd seen scarier paperwork when he refinanced his truck. Still, he decided to play the game properly. That night, under the warm glow of the cabin's single lamp, he sat at his desk and wrote his response, a 3-page letter addressed directly to the HOA president, not Karen. In it, he laid out every legal document proving ownership, every survey line, every time-stamped photo of the trespassing, and ended it with one final paragraph. "If further unauthorized activity continues, I will be left with no choice but to pursue criminal trespass charges and civil damages against all participating parties. I trust we can avoid that outcome." He mailed it first thing in the morning. By the third day, the silence from Karen was suspicious, and that usually meant she was plotting. Around noon, he found out how. The sheriff's truck rolled up again, but this time Daniels wasn't laughing. He stepped out, holding a clipboard. "Got a complaint I'm required to follow up on," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "Claims of aggressive behavior and property intimidation." He raised an eyebrow. "Guess who filed it?" He nodded. "Karen." "You win the prize," Daniels said. He followed the sheriff around the property as he inspected the gate, took a few pictures, and checked the cabin exterior. After a few minutes, Daniels sighed. "There's nothing here. No damage, no threats, no violations. Just a very bored woman who needs a hobby." He grinned faintly. "But since I'm here, might as well enjoy the view." They stood by the fence looking over the valley, quiet for a moment. Daniels shook his head. "She doesn't get it. You could buy her house 3 times over if you wanted, and she's still acting like she runs the county." He chuckled. "Patience," he said. "People like her self-destruct eventually." That night, the self-destruction began. A friend from the HOA board, one of the quieter members who never liked Karen's tactics, called him privately. "You didn't hear it from me," the man whispered, But your email went viral. Half the HOA's furious with her. They've called for an internal audit." He thanked him, hung up, and leaned back, feeling that slow, satisfying warmth of poetic justice. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to fight in the dirt. Truth and timing were better weapons. Over the next few days, the fallout unfolded in small but beautiful ways. Families who'd rented the cabin started filing refund claims against Karen personally. The county sent her a notice of inquiry for unlicensed rental activity. The HOA attorney recused himself, citing conflict of interest. Even the local newsletter ran a small piece about misunderstandings in property boundary management, though everyone knew what that really meant. Still, he wanted closure, not just victory. So he called Daniels again, asked a simple question. "How far can I take this legally without it getting ugly?" Daniels laughed. "Well, ugly's relative, but you've got enough evidence to file trespass, fraud, and maybe even rental misuse. But honestly, the embarrassment might be punishment enough." He nodded. "Maybe. But a fine would drive the point home." So he drafted one last document, a formal demand letter, itemized with all the costs from the cleanup, legal filings, and property wear. The total came out to a surprisingly satisfying number. He hand-delivered it himself, driving down to the HOA office on a quiet afternoon. When he walked in, the receptionist looked startled. Karen was sitting in the back, pale, arguing with someone on the phone. He didn't interrupt. He simply placed the sealed envelope on the counter and said, "Delivery for Mrs. Myers. Property owner reimbursement." The receptionist took it, glanced at the label, and nodded. As he turned to leave, he heard Karen's voice crack mid-sentence. He didn't look back. On the drive home, the sun dipped low behind the mountains, streaking the sky with orange fire. The air smelled like pine and smoke and clean endings. He parked the truck, sat on the porch, and listened to the wind move through the trees. For the first time in weeks, the mountain sounded like itself again. No shouting, no engines, no clipboard snapping in the distance. Just peace. But deep down, he knew something had shifted permanently. The HOA wouldn't cross him again, and Karen's power was broken, but there was a new kind of quiet respect now, a boundary drawn not in words or fences but in the simple truth that he had outlasted her. And somewhere, probably in her kitchen surrounded by legal papers and refund demands, she was finally realizing that every time she tried to trap him, she just built another cage around herself. He smiled at the thought, raised his cup of coffee to the empty sky, and whispered, "Lesson delivered." The following week passed in a strange calm, a kind of quiet that only comes after a storm has worn itself out, and though everything seemed still on the surface, he knew from experience that Karen's silence was never real silence. It was the kind that meant she was busy plotting her comeback behind closed doors. He spent his days working around the cabin, fixing the fence she had tried to cut through, repainting the gate, clearing brush from the drive, each task grounding him in the rhythm of the land that had belonged to his family for generations. Every nail he hammered reminded him why he refused to bend to people like her. The cabin wasn't just a piece of property, it was legacy, memory, and blood all mixed into the wood. His father had built the first section by hand, laying every beam without a single hired man, and he could still remember sitting on the porch steps as a boy, watching him plane the cedar boards smooth while telling stories about the old days when neighbors helped one another instead of fighting over boundaries. Those words had stuck with him, maybe more than he realized, and as he stood there years later looking over the same valley, he wondered what his father would have thought of this new breed of neighbor, the HOA kind, who replaced respect with regulations. He guessed the old man would have laughed, said something about how you can't fence common sense, but you can sure fence stupidity out. Late one afternoon, while he was stacking firewood, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel and turned to see Daniel's truck rolling up the drive again. The sheriff stepped out slowly, tipping his hat. "Heard there's been some developments," Daniel said, leaning against the fender. He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "I figured. Daniels pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Karen filed to sell her house. Listing went live this morning. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. You're kidding. Nope, Daniels said. And guess who's buying it? The HOA president's brother-in-law. Word is, they're getting it cheap, too. She's desperate to get out before the audit finishes. He couldn't help but smile at that, a deep, quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. Guess she learned the hard way you can't rent out what you don't own. Daniels chuckled. Yep, and I think the board finally realized she was more trouble than she was worth. They stood there for a moment, watching the sun dip low over the trees. Daniels sighed. You know, I've been sheriff here 15 years, and I've seen all kinds of land disputes, fences, driveways, goats, you name it, but this one's got to be the strangest. Woman practically tried to annex your mountain. He grinned. She should have read the fine print. That night, after Daniels left, he sat on the porch with the old lantern lit beside him, thinking about how quickly arrogance turns to collapse. The mountain was quiet again, the way it had been before the HOA ever existed, before there were bylaws and board meetings and self-proclaimed enforcers with clipboards. The moonlight caught the outline of the new fence he'd finished earlier that day, a clean wooden barrier marking the start of his land. No signs, no warnings, just quiet certainty. He felt something deeper than triumph. It was closure. Karen's downfall wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about balance being restored. He reached for his old leather notebook, flipping through sketches of property lines, photos of the cabin under construction decades ago, and notes about rainfall, soil, and deer tracks, things that mattered more than paperwork ever could. Somewhere between those pages lay his reason for fighting back. The next morning, a familiar white SUV stopped at the edge of the road. He recognized it immediately, Karen's. She got out slowly, not with the usual confidence, but with something closer to exhaustion. Her hair was tied back loosely, her clipboard gone, and instead of that sharp, superior tone, her voice carried a strange fragility. I came to apologize, she said quietly, walking toward the gate. He didn't answer at first. The sound of the wind filled the space between them. She continued, her words uneven. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought, well, I thought the HOA was helping protect property values, you know? I didn't realize how wrong I was until everything started falling apart. He studied her face, seeing something he hadn't before. Fear, maybe, or shame. People lost money, she said softly. The families, the board, even me. I'm selling the house. I just wanted to say I'm sorry before I go. He looked at her for a long time, searching for sincerity, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavy. You didn't just rent out a cabin, Karen. You tried to own something that was never yours. And that's what happens when you treat community like a business. She lowered her eyes, nodding. I know. I lost everything. For a moment there was silence again, broken only by the creak of the gate in the wind. He didn't gloat. He just said, good luck wherever you go. She nodded once, turned back to her car, and drove away slowly down the winding road until the sound of her tires faded into the valley. He stood there a while longer, watching the dust settle, feeling an odd mixture of relief and melancholy. It wasn't joy exactly, not the kind that comes from winning. It was something quieter, older, a kind of peace that comes from finally closing a long, pointless chapter. When he went back inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and sawdust from the repairs he'd made, and the evening light streamed through the windows like gold dust. He poured himself a drink and sat by the window, looking out at the trees that surrounded him. He thought about how small these battles seemed in the grand picture of things, how the land didn't care about ownership disputes or HOA bylaws. The trees had been there long before any of them, and they would outlast them all. That weekend, Daniels came by again, this time off duty, in jeans and a flannel shirt. He brought burgers and beer, and they grilled out by the porch as the sun went down. Heard Karen closed the sale yesterday, Daniels said between bites. Yep, he replied. House sold to someone local? Some retired couple from out of state. Quiet folks. No HOA nonsense. Daniels laughed. Good. Maybe things will stay peaceful for once. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the frogs down by the creek. After a long pause, Daniels said, You know, you handled this whole thing smarter than most people would've. No shouting, no lawsuits, just patience and planning. He smiled faintly. Guess I learned that from my old man. He used to say never fight loud when you can fight smart. Daniels nodded approvingly. Your old man was right. As night fell, fireflies blinked across the yard, and the sound of laughter echoed faintly from the valley below where neighbors gathered for a small summer fair. It reminded him of simpler times before rules and arguments complicated everything. He leaned back in his chair, the crackle of the fire mixing with the chirp of crickets, and realized he finally felt free of it all, not just of Karen, but of the tension she brought into every corner of the community. The mountain had its peace back, the kind of peace that didn't need to be announced or defended. When Daniels left, he stayed outside a while longer, letting the night wrap around him. The stars were bright, the air cool, and somewhere deep inside, he knew this was the real victory. Not the paperwork, not the fines, not the humiliation she suffered, but the fact that no one could ever again mistake his kindness for weakness. He took one last look at the valley before going inside, the fence standing tall, the gate shining faintly in the moonlight, and thought to himself that maybe, just maybe, some battles were worth fighting simply because home deserves defenders who refuse to back down. The next weekend came with a strange quietness that felt earned, like the mountain itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long, and for the first time in months there wasn't a single unwanted vehicle crawling up the road or a clipboard-wielding neighbor pretending to own what wasn't theirs. He woke up early to the smell of rain-soaked pine drifting through the cracked window and the sound of distant thunder rolling down from the ridge. The world felt clean again. He brewed his coffee, walked out to the porch, and looked at the valley below, green, calm, and wide open. Karen's house sat dark now, the for sale sign gone, the new owners still weeks from moving in. The HOA office hadn't sent a single letter, not even a notice about upcoming community guidelines, and that silence was the sweetest kind of music. He decided he'd celebrate, not with speeches or gloating, but with something simple. An evening barbecue, just him, the sheriff, and a few close neighbors who'd stood by him through the chaos. He spent the morning cleaning up the last traces of that ridiculous weekend when 12 families had turned his driveway into a campground. The gravel was smooth again, the gate freshly painted, and the sign he'd hung last night caught the sunlight just right. Private property, access by invitation only. As the day wore on, he stacked firewood near the pit, marinated the meat, and set up an old string of lights he found in the shed. The cabin looked almost festive by the time Daniel's truck rumbled up the road. The sheriff climbed out holding a paper bag. "Brought pie," he said, grinning. "You always bring pie," he replied. "And yet you never complain," Daniel shot back, and they both laughed. Not long after, 2 more trucks rolled in, Old Man Harris from down the hill, and the Miller family who owned the pasture by the creek. They all pitched in setting up chairs, laying out food, and before long the smell of grilled meat and hickory smoke filled the air. The rain clouds had broken, leaving streaks of pink and gold across the sky. It was the kind of scene that reminded him why he'd fought so hard for this land. As dusk settled, they all gathered around the fire pit, trading stories and laughing about the absurdity of what had happened. Harris joked that Karen probably tried to rent out her moving truck on the way down the valley, and even Daniels laughed so hard he nearly dropped his pie plate. The laughter rolled easy, not cruel, because they all knew the story wasn't just about revenge. It was about standing your ground when people pushed too far. Somewhere around the second round of coffee, Daniels leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, I can't help but think there's poetry in this whole mess. You didn't have to chase her off. She drove herself out." He nodded slowly. "That's the thing about people like her. You give them rope, and they hang themselves with their own pride. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air that drifted upward like tiny fireflies. The smell of wood smoke and rain mixed together, soft and clean. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, the kind that only happens when everyone knows they're exactly where they belong. Later that night, after the others left and Daniel's taillights disappeared down the road, he stayed outside, the embers glowing orange against the dark. He listened to the sound of the creek, the wind shifting through the trees, and thought about how different things felt now. The mountain was his again, not just in deed or law, but in spirit. He thought back to that first night when he'd sat in his truck watching 12 families set up camp on his property, and how he'd felt that slow, cold anger that built not from rage but from disbelief. Now that memory seemed distant, almost funny. He realized that what had started as a fight over property had turned into something bigger, a kind of test of patience, intelligence, and endurance. Karen had underestimated him because she thought kindness and quietness were signs of weakness, but she'd learned that silence could be sharper than any argument. He stood up, walked over to the gate, and looked down the road. The night air was cool, the gravel glistening faintly under the moonlight. He could see the faint outline of tire tracks from earlier visits, but they stopped right at the gate, no further. That was how it should be. He placed a hand on the iron latch, felt the smooth, solid weight of it, and smiled. This wasn't just metal and hinges, it was the line that said never again. He turned back toward the cabin, the porch light warm and soft against the wood, and for a moment, he thought about his father again. The old man would have been proud of the fence, the patience, the quiet victory. He could almost hear his voice saying something like, "The best revenge is peace and a full plate of ribs." That made him laugh out loud to no one in particular. As the night deepened, he poured himself one last cup of coffee and sat on the porch steps, looking down the valley. The lights from distant houses flickered like stars below, and the world felt small and good. He thought about the irony of it all, how Karen had tried to control everyone, to make rules that bent the world her way, and how in the end, she'd been the one left standing in the cold with nothing but a clipboard and a broken reputation. Somewhere out there, maybe in a new town, she was probably already trying to start over, convincing some new neighborhood that her experience in community management was an asset. Maybe she'd even believe it herself. But here, her story was over. Her name had become a kind of legend among the locals, a cautionary tale that people told with a laugh and a shake of the head. The fire had burned down to its last embers when he finally stood, brushed the ash from his jeans, and looked up at the stars. They were bright and steady, the same ones he'd stared at as a boy sitting beside his father, and for the first time in years, he felt like that boy again, content, unbothered, proud of simple things. He turned off the porch light, the glow fading behind him as he stepped inside the cabin. The air was warm, the floorboards creaked just right, and the scent of pine sap still lingered near the window. He paused at the doorway, looking back one last time at the quiet gate and the dark road beyond it, then smiled faintly to himself and whispered, "Let them try renting that." When he lay down, sleep came easy. The wind shifted, brushing softly against the cabin walls, carrying the faint sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the rhythm of peace settling back into the land. Outside, the new private property sign gleamed under the moon, firm and silent, a promise and a warning all at once. And just before he drifted off, he thought about how strange it was that something as small as a locked gate could turn chaos into calm, noise into quiet, and arrogance into humility. But that was the way life worked out here on the mountain. You didn't win by shouting louder, you won by lasting longer. And in the end, that was exactly what he had done.